All right, let's start exactly where this story stops making sense. It's November 1969, Glens Falls, New York, a small town where nothing ever really happens after dark, except late movie showings and diner coffee. On a Friday night, the Adirondack Regent Theater is nearly full. Families, couples, teenagers in the back rows. The film is halfway through when a man in his early 40s stands up, steps into the aisle, and collapses. At first, people think he fainted. Then they notice he isn't breathing. By the time paramedics arrive, the man is dead. No violence, no blood, no sign of a struggle. The official explanation comes quickly and comfortably. A sudden medical episode, heart failure, unfortunate timing. The theater reopens 2 days later. Life moves on. Except one detail doesn't fit. The emergency exit door near the aisle where the man collapsed was locked from the outside. That door was required by law to open freely during screenings, and someone had tampered with it. That detail is written down, noted once, then quietly ignored. Because in small towns, people prefer accidents over answers. Now here's the part nobody in Glens Falls knew that night. That theater had been serviced just 6 days earlier. New sound wiring, minor projector calibration, routine work. The technician signed the log as Orson L. Kincaid, and that name was already hiding in other places. To understand why this matters, you need to know what Orson Kincaid actually did for a living. He wasn't a projectionist, and he wasn't just a handyman. Orson specialized in maintaining old movie theaters, the kind built before World War II, with outdated wiring, poor ventilation, and equipment held together by decades of patches and shortcuts. He traveled constantly. Vermont, northern New York, small towns where theaters were still community centers, and nobody asked too many questions if a man showed up with tools and paperwork. Orson didn't stand out. He was polite, soft-spoken, and forgettable. Late 30s, neatly dressed, always on time. The kind of man managers trusted immediately because he spoke in technical language that discouraged follow-up questions. Most people never remembered his face. That was part of the design. The man who died in the theater was named Caleb Dorn, a traveling insurance adjuster. Married. No known medical issues. According to the coroner, he died of acute respiratory failure, likely triggered by stress or an undiagnosed condition. Case closed. But the ventilation system above his seat had been modified, not damaged, not broken, adjusted. A small rerouting of airflow that concentrated exhaust gases into a narrow section of the auditorium, enough to cause dizziness, enough to restrict oxygen, not enough to trigger alarms or affect the rest of the room. Whoever did it understood airflow patterns extremely well, and that wasn't common knowledge in 1969. This is where Detective Thaddeus Mallory enters the story. Mallory worked for the New York State Police, assigned mostly to reviewing unusual fatalities that didn't quite justify full investigations. Paperwork cases, dead ends, the kind of work nobody fought over. Caleb Dorn's death crossed his desk because of a single note from the local fire inspector mentioning the exit door and the modified ductwork. Mallory didn't think murder immediately. He thought negligence. He thought liability. But then he checked the maintenance logs and saw Orson's name. That name rang a faint bell. Not loud enough to alarm him yet, but loud enough to stay in his head. Now we need to rewind, except the metal didn't snap. It separated cleanly at a single joint. A joint that had been serviced 3 days earlier by a contractor brought in to inspect structural safety for a nearby renovation project. That contractor was Orson Kincaid. No one questioned it at the time. Inspections happen. Accidents happen. Life continues. Orson left town 2 days later. This pattern would repeat, slowly, quietly, across years and across state lines. Different towns, different buildings, different causes of death. One man suffocated in a print shop after ventilation failure. A woman electrocuted by a faulty fuse box in a boarding house. A maintenance worker poisoned by chemicals used to clean film reels. Each case ruled accidental. Each scene recently serviced, Each city convinced it was unlucky, not targeted. What made Orson dangerous was not brutality, but patience. He didn't need weapons. He didn't need speed. He didn't need to see blood. He only needed access, time, and systems people already trusted. He never repeated methods. He never stayed long. And he never killed people who would be loudly missed. Back in Glens Falls, Mallory started pulling old files. Rutland, Brattleboro, Plattsburgh. The same name appeared again and again, sometimes buried in contractor invoices, sometimes in handwritten logs no one had read in years. Orson L. Kincaid, always before, never after. Mallory didn't announce anything. He didn't call it a serial case. He didn't even tell his supervisor what he was thinking. Because in 1969, accusing someone of being a serial killer without bodies, blood, or weapons would get you laughed out of the room. Instead, Mallory did what Orson never expected. He followed the paperwork. And paperwork, unlike people, doesn't forget. Meanwhile, Orson was already on the move again. Another theater, another town, another system ready to be adjusted just enough to fail. The man who died in Glens Falls was not the target. He was a proof of concept, and Orson Kincaid wasn't finished. In part 2, we're going to talk about who Orson really was, where this obsession with systems came from, and how his first intentional kill reshaped the way he saw control, punishment, and death. Before Orson Kincaid ever touched a theater vent or a fire escape, before his name began quietly appearing in maintenance logs across Vermont and New York, he was just another kid growing up in a town people passed through without stopping. Orson Leander Kincaid was born in 1931 in Barre, Vermont, a granite town built on dust, machinery, and routine. His father worked in stone cutting sheds. His mother cleaned offices at night. The house was small, quiet, and rigid, a place where mistakes were noticed immediately and praised success was rare. Orson learned early that attention came only when something went wrong, and that staying unnoticed was safer than standing out. He wasn't violent as a child, not angry in the obvious way, but he was observant to an uncomfortable degree. Teachers described him as mechanical, a word they used when a child asked too many how questions and not enough why questions. Orson wanted to know how doors closed, how sound traveled through walls, how pressure built up in pipes, how air moved in enclosed spaces. While other kids memorized baseball scores, Orson memorized building layouts. When he was 15, something happened that never left him. A projection booth fire broke out in a small local theater during a Saturday matinee. No one died, but the panic was real. Smoke filled the auditorium, people rushed exits, some doors jammed, others funneled crowds into narrow aisles. Orson wasn't inside the theater. He was outside, watching people spill into the street, coughing, shouting, confused. Later that night, he went back with a friend and studied the building. The fire itself hadn't caused the panic, the building had. That realization stayed with him. After high school, Orson avoided college and enlisted briefly, but was discharged early for what records described as unsuitable temperament. He wasn't aggressive or insubordinate, just detached, overly analytical, uninterested in camaraderie. He drifted after that, learning trades that kept him close to systems and far from people. Electrical repair, mechanical maintenance, sound equipment, projection systems. By the late 1950s, Orson had found his niche, old theaters. They were perfect environments, aging wiring, outdated safety standards, minimal inspections, and a deep trust placed in anyone who spoke confidently about technical issues. Theater managers wanted cheap fixes, fast solutions, and someone who wouldn't ask questions. Orson delivered exactly that. He learned everything about how spaces controlled people, how sound masked distress, how lighting affected awareness, how ventilation could be adjusted subtly enough that no one noticed until it was too late. He understood that most deaths didn't need force, they needed conditions. The first time Orson realized he could kill someone without touching them wasn't planned. In 1962, in Rutland, Vermont, he was contracted to inspect exterior safety structures near a warehouse renovation, including a fire escape attached to a 3-story building. During the inspection, He noticed a joint that had been replaced incorrectly years earlier. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it would be under the right stress. At the same time, Orson had been watching Edwin Lawton, a supervisor who routinely belittled workers, ignored safety complaints, and treated people like replaceable parts. Orson didn't hate him emotionally, he categorized him. To Orson, Lawton was a failure of the system, someone who benefited from order while contributing to disorder. The decision wasn't sudden. Orson didn't sabotage the latter outright. He made a precise adjustment, reducing load tolerance while leaving the structure visually intact. He knew when Lawton took smoke breaks. He knew where he stood. He knew when no one else would be around. When Lawton fell days later, the report cited corrosion and age. Inspectors shook their heads, wrote recommendations, and moved on. Orson read the report twice, not for guilt, for confirmation. That was the moment everything changed. Not because someone died, but because the system responded exactly as Orson predicted. No questions, no blame, just acceptance. From that point forward, Orson stopped seeing his actions as crimes. He saw them as corrections. He began refining his internal rules. Never create damage that looked new. Never interfere after the fact. Always let the system finish the job. Most importantly, never choose victims who would trigger loud grief or aggressive investigations. The quiet deaths mattered more. By the time he reached Brattleboro in 1964, Orson was deliberate. The suffocation in the print shop wasn't accidental. He had adjusted the ventilation dampers weeks earlier, calculating how long it would take fumes to accumulate during overnight work. The man who died had complained about safety before. That was enough for Orson. The boarding house electrocution came later, using an outdated fuse box and a grounding flaw Orson recognized immediately. Again, no panic, no chase, just paperwork. What kept him invisible was not intelligence alone, but restraint. Orson never watched his victims die directly after the first incident. He didn't need to. He trusted the process. He trusted the rooms. And while deaths accumulated quietly, Orson moved through towns like a ghost, leaving behind invoices, signed logs, and repaired. He wasn't reliving kills, he was improving designs, which is why Glens Falls mattered. The theater there wasn't just another job, it was a culmination, a controlled environment with predictable human behavior, a space designed to hold people still and quiet for long periods. When Caleb Dorn collapsed, Orson didn't see a death. He saw validation on a larger scale. What Orson didn't account for was something he had always dismissed. Patterns don't need blood to be seen. They need time. And somewhere, in an office filled with folders and yellowed reports, Thaddeus Mallory was beginning to understand that these weren't accidents scattered across towns, but rooms designed to fail, one quiet death at a time. In Part 3, we're going to follow the investigation as it finally takes shape. The moment Mallory stops seeing negligence and starts seeing intent, and the mistake Orson makes when he assumes paperwork is harmless. Up to this point, everything about Orson Kincaid's story worked because no one was looking at the whole picture. Each town saw only its own tragedy. Each inspector focused on a single failure. Each report ended with the same quiet conclusion. Unfortunate accident. No further action required. That's how systems protect themselves, by isolating events and discouraging anyone from asking what connects them. That changed the moment Thaddeus Mallory stopped reading reports vertically and started reading them sideways. Mallory had been with the New York State Police long enough to recognize the difference between chaos and pattern. Chaos is noisy. Patterns are quiet. They hide inside paperwork, spacing themselves out, wearing different masks so no one thinks to compare them. When the Glens Falls theater file landed on his desk, he didn't feel alarm. He felt familiarity, the uncomfortable sense that he had seen this shape before. He pulled older cases from storage, not because procedure demanded it, but because instinct did. Industrial accidents, building failures, deaths that made sense individually and felt wrong collectively. He laid them out by year, not by location. That was the first mistake no one else had made before him. Rutland, fire escape collapse, Brattleboro, ventilation failure, Plattsburgh, electrical incident in a boarding house, Glens Falls, theater ventilation and exit door interference. Different states, different causes, same timing pattern. Each incident followed recent maintenance or inspection work. Not sloppy work, not rushed work, but professional, documented service. The kind that reassured building owners everything was safe. Mallory started pulling invoices and service logs. Most names appeared once, maybe twice. Contractors moved on. Businesses changed hands. But one name kept reappearing like a watermark you only notice when you tilt the page. Orson L. Kincaid. Sometimes as a subcontractor, sometimes as a temporary specialist, sometimes buried under a larger company's letterhead. Always present shortly before failure, never after. Always leaving clean paperwork behind. At this stage, Mallory still wasn't hunting a serial killer. He suspected negligence, maybe intentional shortcuts, maybe someone padding invoices and ignoring safety. That alone was enough to justify deeper digging. What bothered him was how precise the failures were. They didn't look like wear and tear. They looked like tolerance pushed just far enough. So Mallory started calling people. Fire inspectors, old building managers, retired electricians. He asked simple questions, not about death, but about the work. Did anything feel unusual? Did the technician insist on changes that weren't requested? Did he talk more about systems than safety? The answers were never dramatic, but they were consistent. He was quiet, but very sure of himself. Didn't argue, just explained things like you wouldn't understand. Always said the building would behave the way it was designed to. One retired theater manager said something that stuck with Mal. He remembered Orson saying almost casually that people panic because buildings lie to them, and that good design tells the truth, even if people don't like it. That wasn't how repairmen talked. While Mallory followed paper, Orson felt something shift. He didn't know Mallory's name yet, but he sensed interference. Calls asking for old documentation. Inspectors revisiting sites years after incidents. Questions about minor adjustments no one had cared about before. The machine was no longer running silently. Orson responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. He spaced his work farther apart geographically. He avoided repeat environments. He stopped making adjustments that required immediate failure and focused instead on delayed outcomes, changes that would only manifest weeks or months later. To him, this wasn't fear, it was refinement. But refinement creates complexity, and complexity increases exposure. In late 1968, Orson took a job in Plattsburgh at a small municipal archive building, an unremarkable place storing old records and microfilm. The ventilation system was outdated, underpowered, and shared between multiple rooms. Orson made a minor adjustment, redirecting airflow away from a storage room where a night clerk worked alone. The plan was slow oxygen deprivation, subtle enough to look medical, untraceable enough to vanish into another report. It didn't work the way he expected. The clerk, a woman named Irene Walsh, collapsed but survived. Paramedics noted dizziness and confusion, but she recovered after treatment. The incident was logged as exhaustion, combined with poor air circulation. Except Irene remembered something. She remembered the technician who had worked on the vents weeks earlier. She remembered his voice, calm and instructive, explaining how airflow would feel different and that it was normal. She mentioned this casually to a supervisor, who mentioned it to an inspector, who mentioned it to a state investigator. That investigator was Mallory. Now Mallory had something he didn't have before, a living witness. He interviewed Irene personally. She couldn't explain what was wrong with the technician's behavior, only that he seemed more interested in the room than in her, more focused on how long she stayed inside than on whether the system met code. That was enough. Mallory requested authorization to track Orson Kincaid quietly. No arrest, no confrontation, just observation. where he worked, where he stayed, what kinds of buildings he preferred. The pattern became clearer the longer Mallory watched. Orson chose enclosed spaces, shared air, old wiring, predictable routines. He avoided open environments. He avoided randomness. Most importantly, he avoided witnesses. Except now, witnesses were forming anyway. The Glens Falls Theater investigation was reopened, not publicly, but internally. Fire inspectors re-examined the ventilation changes. Engineers confirmed the airflow adjustment was deliberate, not accidental. The exit door lock modification was subtle, but intentional. Mallory didn't rush. He understood something crucial about men like Orson. You don't catch them by forcing mistakes. You catch them by letting them believe the system still belongs to them. Orson, meanwhile, believed he was ahead. He had no idea that his greatest strength, documentation, had become his greatest weakness. Every invoice, every log, every signature he left behind as proof of professionalism was now a breadcrumb. The rooms were starting to talk to each other, and Mallory was listening. By the beginning of 1970, Orson Kincaid was no longer just adjusting systems. He was managing pressure. He could feel it in the way contracts were approved more slowly, in how inspectors suddenly asked follow-up questions, in how people wanted explanations instead of signatures. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough resistance to tell him that the environment around him had changed. For Orson, this wasn't a warning to stop. It was a signal that the system needed one final correction. The job that followed came from a place he knew well, a small community hall in Brattleboro, Vermont, used for town meetings, movie nights, and local events. The building was old, cheap to maintain, and recently cited for poor air circulation. Orson was brought in to improve ventilation efficiency. On paper, it was harmless, boring work. In reality, it was the perfect enclosed space. The hall had a predictable schedule, limited exits, and a single maintenance corridor that controlled airflow for the entire building. Orson studied it carefully, not as a repairman, but as a designer. He adjusted dampers, redirected exhaust paths, and calibrated airflow so that one section of the hall would receive reduced oxygen while remaining visually normal. No alarms, no smells, just slow cognitive failure. This time, Orson planned to stay nearby, not to watch death, but to confirm control. The event was a weekend film screening, nothing controversial, mostly older residents and families. Halfway through the showing, several people reported dizziness. One man collapsed, another vomited. Panic began to rise, but unlike the Glens Falls Theater, the exits worked. People got out. Emergency crews arrived fast, and this time, someone died. The official cause was ruled acute respiratory failure caused by ventilation malfunction. The report looked clean. The city blamed outdated infrastructure. Repairs were ordered. But Orson had miscalculated something crucial. Too many people were affected. One death could disappear quietly. Multiple symptoms could be explained. But a room full of witnesses who felt the same thing at the same time created a shared memory. And shared memory is dangerous. Thaddeus Mallory was notified within hours. When he arrived, he didn't rush to conclusions. He walked the building slowly, with engineers, with inspectors, with people who spoke Orson's language. And this time, the conclusion was different. The ventilation changes weren't random. They weren't wear and tear. They were intentional adjustments made to restrict airflow selectively. Someone had designed the failure. Mallory pulled the maintenance logs. Orson L. Kincaid. Again. Now the investigation crossed a line. Up until this point, Mallory had patterns, proximity, and suspicion. Now he had a recent death, expert confirmation of deliberate system manipulation, and multiple witnesses who could describe the effects. It still wasn't enough to arrest Orson outright, but it was enough to move from observation to preparation. Mallory requested quiet warrants, not to raid, not to arrest, but to look. They searched Orson's rented storage unit first. Inside, there was nothing that screamed murder. No weapons, no blood, just tools. Perfectly organized, labeled, cleaned. Wiring diagrams, ventilation manuals, old theater blueprints, notes written in neat, careful handwriting. But the notes weren't names. They were environments, room dimensions, airflow arrows, exit counts, crowd density estimates, times of day. This wasn't a repairman's notebook. It was a planner's. Hidden inside a metal toolbox, they found something else. Personal items, a wallet with no cash, a man's watch, a pair of reading glasses. Objects that had no reason to be there. Mallory didn't touch them himself. He had learned patience. They traced the items slowly, carefully. One belonged to Edwin Lawton, another to Caleb Dorn, another to a man who died years earlier in Brattleboro. Orson hadn't kept them as trophies. He kept them as proof. Meanwhile, Orson sensed the shift immediately. The jobs stopped coming. Calls weren't returned. His name wasn't rejected outright, but it was delayed, postponed, buried. The system he depended on was quietly freezing him out. So he planned one last operation, not for validation, for closure. The target was a small, independent theater outside Plattsburgh, New York, scheduled for demolition within months. Orson believed this would be his cleanest design yet. No long-term consequences, no follow-ups. One final correction before disappearing completely. He didn't know Mallory was already waiting. State police tracked his arrival. They watched him enter the building after hours. They observed him accessing the ventilation system and emergency lighting controls. They recorded the time, the sequence, the changes. This wasn't a sting. This wasn't a trap. It was confirmation. When Orson left the building, he wasn't arrested. Not yet. Mallory understood that Orson didn't panic, didn't flee, didn't destroy evidence. He trusted his systems too much. He believed that if nothing happened immediately, nothing would ever happen. That belief was the last thing holding him in place. The next morning, before the scheduled screening, police closed the building. Engineers reversed Orson's changes. The theater never reopened, and Orson was summoned for questioning. He came willingly. He sat calmly. He explained his work professionally. He denied intent. He framed everything as maintenance decisions within acceptable tolerances. Mallory didn't argue. He laid out the notebooks, the tools, the witness statements, the matching signatures, the personal items, the expert analyses, not accusations, a pattern. Orson didn't break, he didn't confess. But something in his expression changed. Not fear, recognition. For the first time, the system was no longer responding the way he predicted, and that terrified him. By the time Orson Kincaid walked out of that first interview room, he already understood something had fundamentally changed. No one accused him. No one raised their voice. No one tried to scare him. That was the problem. The questions were too specific, too calm, too informed. They weren't fishing. They were confirming. For the first time in nearly a decade, Orson felt the system stop responding the way it was supposed to. Up until now, every environment had obeyed him. Buildings failed when he calculated they would fail. Paperwork buried deaths the way he expected it to. Inspectors looked forward, not backward. But now the machine was doing something new. It was looking at him. Thaddeus Mallory didn't rush the arrest, and that decision mattered. He understood that Orson wasn't the kind of man who panicked or ran. He was the kind of man who stayed still as long as he believed he was in control. So Mallory let him stay still. Over the next several weeks, investigators moved quietly. They didn't announce a task force. They didn't alert the press. They went city by city, building by building, revisiting spaces Orson had touched. Fire escapes, ventilation shafts, fuse boxes, emergency lighting circuits. Everything was documented, photographed, and reconstructed with engineers who understood how small adjustments could produce lethal outcomes. What they found wasn't chaos, it was consistency. Every modification followed the same logic. Reduce tolerance, redirect stress, create failure that looks natural. Not destruction, but encouragement. The systems didn't break. They were guided. At the same time, Mallory's team tracked Orson's movements through the least dramatic sources possible. Motel registries, gas station receipts, hardware store purchases, supply orders for specific chemicals used in film cleaning and ventilation maintenance. None of it was illegal. All of it was precise. And precision leaves a trail. The real turning point came from the objects found in Orson's storage unit. At first glance, they didn't look like trophies. No blood, no names, no dates written on them. Just personal items stored carefully, cleaned, preserved. A watch, a wallet, glasses, a tie pin. When investigators matched them to the dead, the meaning became clear. These weren't souvenirs. They were confirmations, proof that the person connected to the environment had been successfully removed. That detail mattered in court because it showed intent. Mallory brought Orson in for a second interview, this time with evidence laid out on the table. Not accusations, comparisons. Diagrams of ventilation systems overlaid with death timelines. Fire escape stress calculations matched to fall reports. Chemical exposure charts aligned with coroner findings. Orson listened. He corrected a diagram once. That was his mistake. The moment he pointed out an airflow inconsistency, the room changed. Mallory didn't react outwardly, but the technicians did. Orson had just demonstrated knowledge that no innocent contractor should have had unless he had designed the failure himself. From that moment on, the case accelerated. Orson was arrested without spectacle. No handcuffs in public. No headlines yet. Just a quiet transfer into custody. The charges were specific, not dramatic. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, aggravated negligence resulting in death, and intentional sabotage of public infrastructure. The trial began in late 1971. It wasn't flashy. There were no confessions, no emotional outbursts. Orson sat quietly, dressed plainly, listening as experts explained how his work created invisible traps. Engineers testified. Fire inspectors testified. Medical examiners explained how oxygen deprivation, electrical current, and chemical exposure could be lethal without leaving obvious signs. Witnesses described Orson the same way every time. Calm, polite, professional, forgettable. That consistency worked against him, because monsters don't need to look monstrous. The jury didn't need to understand every technical detail. They needed to understand one thing. These deaths didn't happen randomly. They happened after one man arrived, touched the systems, and left. Orson never testified. He never denied what the evidence showed. He never admitted guilt either. His defense argued that coincidence and outdated infrastructure explained everything. But coincidence doesn't repeat itself with such discipline. When the verdict came back, it was unanimous. Guilty. Sentencing followed weeks later. Given the number of victims, the calculated nature of the crimes, and the use of public spaces as weapons, the judge imposed the death penalty. Orson showed no visible reaction. In the months that followed, newspapers finally caught up. Headlines called him the theater killer, the ventilation murderer, the man who turned buildings into weapons. None of the names mattered to him. In his final interview with a prison psychologist, Orson said only one thing that was recorded. Rooms tell the truth. People just don't listen. The execution took place quietly. No statement, no apology. Just the end of a man who believed control lived in wires, ducts, and exits, and who never understood that systems are only powerful until someone learns how to read them back. The execution of Orson Leander Kincaid took place early in the morning, long before sunrise. in a room that looked exactly like every other room he had ever studied. Clean lines, controlled airflow, minimal sound, designed to function without emotion. Witnesses later said he appeared calm, almost curious, as if he were observing the room rather than occupying it. There was no final speech. The aftermath did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, the way truth often does in small towns, through uncomfortable conversations, reopened records, and the slow realization that what people had called bad luck had actually been design. In Glens Falls, the theater never reopened. It sat empty for years, its doors locked, its projector room sealed, until it was eventually demolished. Former employees said they could never sit in a dark auditorium again without thinking about airflow, exits, and silence. In Rutland, the fire escape where Edwin Lawton fell was replaced, then replaced again, over-engineered far beyond regulation. Workers joked about it at first, then stopped joking when the story resurfaced in newspapers. In Brattleboro and Plattsburgh, building inspections changed. Not officially, not through legislation, but through behavior. Inspectors asked more questions. Maintenance logs were read more carefully. Contractors were remembered, not just paid. Thaddeus Mallory never called it a victory. In private interviews years later, he said the most disturbing part of the case wasn't how Orson killed, but how long it took anyone to notice. No disguises, no false identities, no dramatic violence. Just patience, paperwork, and trust exploited quietly over time. Mallory kept Orson's notebooks locked away, not for their content, but for what they represented. Proof that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it signs the invoice, fixes the wiring, and leaves town before anyone knows something is wrong. Families of the victims received confirmation, not comfort. Knowing that a loved one's death had meaning did not make it hurt less. It only changed the shape of the grief. Some were angry that no one had questioned the accident sooner. Others were relieved to finally have an answer. Years later, journalists would ask why Orson kept personal items from the dead. The answer, according to psychologists who studied the case, was not sentiment or pride. It was verification. Orson needed proof that the system had worked, that the environment had obeyed him, that the correction was complete. He never believed he was evil. That, more than anything, is what frightened people. Today, most of the buildings Orson worked on are gone, renovated, demolished, replaced by newer structures with modern codes and digital safeguards. But the lesson of his crimes remains uncomfortable and timeless. Danger does not always come from rage or chaos. Sometimes it comes from quiet competence, from someone who understands how things are supposed to work and knows exactly how far they can be pushed before they fail. Orson Kincaid did not stalk his victims. He prepared their surroundings. And for years, the rooms did exactly what he designed them to do, until someone finally learned how to listen. This is the end of his story.